Yesterday, Donald Trump boasted he had blown Iran off the map, threatening to obliterate its power plants. Then, today, under the shadow of Air Force One, this.
We are in the throes of a real possibility of making a deal, and I think if I were a betting man, I'd bet for it. But again, I'm not guaranteeing anything. They want to make a deal very badly.
Well, that was unexpected. A deal, said Trump, who had woken up at his Florida estate. And from Mar-a-Lago, given us this at 7:23 a.m. Writing on Truth Social, Trump said he was pleased to report that the US and Iran over 2 days had had in-depth, detailed and constructive conversations, and he would now postpone those threatened strikes on energy infrastructure for a 5-day period. As so often, it was in screaming caps. But how the markets moved. Stocks up, oil prices down. After Trump claimed his negotiators, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, had spoken to a senior Iranian official, later named as this man, Speaker of Iran's parliament, Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf. He said it was fake news as the Iranians denied talks.
15 points. 15 points.
But Trump said that was how many points they could agree on. So who would control the Strait of Hormuz?
Be jointly controlled.
By who?
Maybe me. Maybe me.
You want the United States to be in
Me
control
and
of
the
Strait of
Ayatollah,
Hormuz?
whoever the Ayatollah is.
Trump said he'd now found Iranian regime members who were very solid, very respected and reasonable.
We're doing a 5-day period. We'll see how that goes. And if it goes well, we're going to end up with settling this. Otherwise, we'll just keep bombing our little hearts out.
The president was only talking about energy infrastructure targets, with the US military releasing more images of general strikes yesterday and Israel hitting Tehran today, continuing a barrage for which the human cost is being uncovered day by day. Occasional miracles, like finding this survivor deep below the rubble, is only a moment of respite from the tragic reality of war. For their part, the Iranians said there had been a request for talks, with reports suggesting they do not trust Witkoff and instead want to talk to Vice President J.D. Vance, known for his anti-war views.
All we know is Iran is not willing to go back to the status quo.
Alan Eyre, who helped negotiate the 2015 Iran deal, argues this war will only harden the country's resolve in the future. Do you think Donald Trump will be regretting his decision to go to war in Iran?
One would hope he would regret it because he's done serious and sustained damage to U.S. national interests, to say nothing of the energy infrastructure that the world depends on going forward. Not just oil, not just gas, LNG, fertilizer, helium, all these things.
Of demonstrating how serious this mission is.
Some think this is all the art of the deal. Others, another taco moment, Trump always chickening out. In fact, was this him passing the buck at an event in Memphis today?
Pete, I think you were the first one to speak up, and you said, let's do it, because you can't let them have a nuclear weapon.
Trump suggesting his war secretary urged him on into a conflict that has seen one of the world's most important waterways virtually blocked, raising fears that it was choking off not just global oil supplies, but the president's popularity back home. So look, one really interesting thing here is, what do the Israelis think about this? Benjamin Netanyahu has long made clear he doesn't want a deal with Iran. He vehemently opposed the deal that Barack Obama negotiated back in 2015. Now, he has spoken as we were coming on air, and he has said that Trump believes that this is a chance to leverage the achievements of both the IDF and the US military to realise his war goals. So, sounding supportive, I think he probably knows better than to disagree with Donald Trump in this moment. But if we think about what is going to happen now, the negotiator you saw me speaking to there was arguing that talks haven't actually happened. The Americans have reached out to the Iranians, and now we might enter into negotiations. And the reality is that they all have different red lines. And he thinks that the red lines between Iran and the US are still quite far apart. For example, Iran will want to continue to have control of the Strait of Hormuz after all of this. Also, they want to see the US out of military bases in the region. So the argument is, yes, they might be going into negotiations. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get closer to what they want ultimately. And if you think that the red lines are far apart between Iran and the US, well, they are even further apart when it comes to Iran and Israel. Whatever Benjamin Netanyahu is saying right now, it's going to be a very difficult path forward.
Anushka in Washington, D.C., thanks very much indeed. And we'll be speaking to a former and perhaps future Israeli Prime Minister in a few minutes. Now, there were wild swings on the financial markets today, with oil prices plummeting on the hint of peace, but then surging again as doubt set in. Shares and government borrowing costs followed those gyrations in the energy prices. Our economics editor, Helia Ebrahimi, has been following it all. Helia, over to you.
Well, Matt, it's been a day of whiplash, moving from dread to optimism in those wild swings, as you were saying, as the market has been led by the nose by what President Trump puts out on his socials. Stock markets in Asia and Europe opened today in correction territory. That means down 10% from the peak as traders responded to the president's weekend threat that he would level up the war and attack Iranian power plants. With oil price up and American gas stations charging $5.80 a gallon, the US market looks set to open in the red too, when suddenly, just in the nick of time, the president put out another Truth Social message saying he'd postponed the attack. Here's oil, starting the day on all of those anxieties, up at $113. Then around 11 a.m. UK time, you see Trump's message drops and you have this massive move, oil falling below that all-important $100 a barrel level. That feeds so quickly through to the real economy, falling to $97 initially, but it doesn't stay there as traders start to unpick whether Trump can really deliver, as Anushka was saying earlier, on his promise to end the conflict. Now, this volatility also played out in US borrowing costs, which are critical, Matt, because treasuries are a key point of economic pain for the White House. You can see short-term yields spiked over 4% before that dramatic fall. And take a look at the next chart, which shows you how critical today's starting position was. You can see that yellow line charting backwards is debt costs going to their highest point not seen since June last year.
And let's talk about the UK. Where does it leave the UK in all this fallout?
Well, Matt, UK borrowing costs has been the worst performer of any country in this crisis, rising to the highest level since the mini-budget. Two-year gilts fell after Trump's post, then rose again and then fell in those wild gyrations you were talking about. For the UK, where inflation has been higher than the Bank of England's target for the last 5 years, despite interest rate cuts we've had, there's a real anxiety about the impact on consumers and prices, even if the war ends this week. And today there was talk of interest rate hikes happening 3-4 times this year, which would be a huge pain for consumers.
Crikey, Helia Ebrahimi, thanks very much indeed. Well, Jen Gavita is a former US diplomat who served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iran and Iraq in President Biden's administration. She joins me now. Jen Gavita, good to have you on the program. Could you make head or tails of what Trump was saying today? Because there seems to be some ambiguity and fuzziness. Are you clear about what's actually being proposed by him and what he claims?
No, not only is there ambiguity in his statement, but there's ambiguity as to whether these talks that he professes have been ongoing for the last 2 days are actually taking place yet. We're hearing conflicting reports. And so it's really not clear at all what is on the table. I think the messaging to be read behind it, though, is that he's essentially sending up a trial balloon, testing out options for finding that all anticipated off-ramp. And so, you know, I think it's a good thing that they are considering what an end to this conflict may look like, but I don't think that we yet have a sense of what the parameters for it may be.
So is this geopolitics by throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks?
Absolutely. You pick your metaphor, but 100%. And, you have talked about Prime Minister Netanyahu's response. We've certainly seen responses from the Iranians. I think it is always important to remember that there are actually three parties to this conflict. And for it to end, you'll need all three parties on board. And so all of them are positioning at this point. I think that's what we're seeing today, seeing, not just what sticks publicly, but what sticks with our allies and partners and with our adversary in this case.
Indeed. And it's interesting that J.D. Vance, who's been in a bit of a witness protection program about this whole war, has suddenly sort of, and has been said by Trump himself not to have liked the idea of it at all, has suddenly been kind of anointed, promoted to become the chief negotiator. What's that all about?
So I think that, first of all, if Vice President Vance was an early skeptic, then there is some utility in taking someone who maybe was more committed to ensuring the U.S. does not find itself in another one of these extended, protracted conflicts in the Middle East, putting him in charge of those discussions. I also take it as a positive in that certainly he has more foreign policy experience than, for example, Steve Witkoff. And after the last round of negotiations were in fact disrupted by the initiation of this U.S.-Israeli operation, I think there's a lot of Iranian skepticism about Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner as reliable intermediaries. So I take it as a positive sign that Vice President Vance is getting involved.
Okay, interesting. I mean, the markets are obviously relieved, or they were very relieved, and they're slightly less relieved, understandably. But what about, the American public? And what about the fact that you've got, President Trump saying that he's sitting down with people to negotiate that he described as the epitome of evil just a few weeks ago. And now he wants to negotiate with them. And they're saying, actually, he doesn't even talk to us.
So, yeah, the piece not talking to us is a bit odd. But as far as negotiation goes, I think, one thing that has been widely accepted, certainly, amongst the foreign policy community, is the idea that this conflict cannot be entirely resolved militarily. At some point, there will have to be negotiations. Regime change is not a likely outcome of this conflict. And so, therefore, there is going to have to be a meeting of the minds, as it were, in order to find an off-ramp from all sides. And so a negotiated solution is absolutely critical to bringing this to an end. So I'm not surprised to hear the parties hurling insults at each other. But on the other hand, if quiet conversations can start to put the parameters in place to draw this to a close, again, I think that is a net positive.
And once again, you have a war of choice that has taught America some lessons in geography about the Strait of Hormuz, but also about the limitations of its own power. And the fact is, at the end of the day, the Iranians own those straits.
That's absolutely correct. And, up until this conflict, that was always seen as the nuclear option, the closure of the strait. The United States certainly has prepared for that for years. And so, there is a new reality that has been put in place through this. Iran has figured out that it can really disrupt the global economy through pretty low-cost means. And there's really no putting that genie back in the bottle. And so, how you restore confidence to that trade route, given the continued risk of again, transit being disrupted through drones or mining, again, pretty low cost, easy means, that's going to be a huge hill to climb. And, arguably is a bit separate from the rest of the negotiations, whenever they take place over the conflict. Among other things, you're going to have to ensure the insurance markets that transit is sufficiently safe, that these tankers can be insured.
Indeed. Well, that's going to be a tricky issue as well. Jen Gavito, thanks very much indeed. And we've also been speaking to Jen for the latest episode of The Forecast, along with Helia and Reynard Mansour, Senior Fellow in the Middle East Programme at Chatham House. Find out if Trump really has chickened out over Iran and whether it takes 2 or maybe even 3 to attack her. You can find it on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, let's get the view from or about Iran. Sanam Naragi Andalini is an expert in conflict resolution and gender and is head of the International Civil Society Action Network. Thanks for coming on the program. So, I mean, do you think that the Ayatollahs, the ones that are left, the rump regime, regard this as a major victory?
You know, I don't know whether they regard it as a major victory. I don't even know whether that's a relevant question at this point. What we should be looking at is the fact that you have a regime that is sacrificing a nation for its own survival in Iran. And then on the Israeli side, Israel that is willing to sacrifice Iran and the region, frankly, for its own survival. And it's sort of managed to muster up a diaspora that supported it. And in the middle, right now, both in Lebanon and Iran, you have people who are suffering. 67,000 homes have been destroyed. We've had petrochemical plants. We've had 2 missiles, a projectile and a missile lobbed at 2 different nuclear sites. It's serious. And the grown-ups are, I don't know what they're doing. You know, they're making money off the markets, or they're making fun of, you know, whatever Trump is saying. This is horrific, actually, what's going on. And we need a bit more serious attention from the diplomatic circles and aligned with international law.
Well, perhaps there aren't any grown-ups left.
Oh, no, there are. I think that what we've seen is the Omanis, for example, who have been very courageous and came out very upfront saying, this is a war of choice. It was Israel's choice to start this war. We have others in Europe who are standing up for it. In England, we have to make sure that we uphold our responsibility at the Security Council. We're there to mitigate conflict. We're there to be the firemen, not the arsonists. And the implications of this spreading are terrible for all of us, as we've all heard. So I think the question is, if you're allies with the U.S., bring them to the table. But really importantly, make sure that there's some guardrails around what Israel's doing, because it's not just in Iran. It's also Lebanon, the West Bank, and Gaza that's on fire as well.
Indeed. If this regime survives in whatever form, what can the people of Iran expect in the coming months and years?
That's a really good question, because what was happening inside Iran was that people from below, people were already making a lot of the changes and pushing for the changes. The economic sanctions, the maximum pressure sanctions that really quashed the poor and the middle class was a detriment to the public demand for change, and it emboldened the regime. This war, again, has hardened the regime. What we need to do is to remove that outside pressure so that actually Iranians can breathe and they can engage the government and what's left of it, as you say, and including all the progressives and the political opposition. All the political prisoners need to be freed, and no one's even talking about them. But there is tremendous sort of political capital inside the country.
Right, and as we, maybe perhaps reach a pause in the fighting that might last beyond 5 days, do you think it's possible that people will come back on the streets again and do the very thing that the Americans asked them to do at the beginning of the war, but they were too frightened to do?
Again, it's really hard to tell what the people will do, because the security infrastructure hasn't been destroyed. Iran has an army and a police force like normal, like other countries, but they also have the Basij and the IRGC, and they are everywhere. And if you destroy police stations, as the Israelis have been doing, the Basij is kind of embedded in the communities. They are of the communities, and they are on the streets right now. So I think we have to wait and see really what happens, but the pressure has to come off before the Iranian public can actually engage in their own political process. And with bombs dropping and the fear of, food and salaries and so forth, I think right now they've got other things on their mind.
Do you think that there's any way that this regime can do a deal with Israel and the United States that is acceptable to the regime, but also acceptable to Israel, that circle can be squared?
Again, great question. The issue of the dilemma with Israel is also situated in the question of Palestine. So if Israel were to agree to end the occupation and return to its own 1948 borders, I think a lot of things could get resolved. The problem of Lebanon would be dealt with. Palestinian statehood could be addressed. And actually, it would diminish any animosity that Iran has with Israel. That's always been one of the issues. That why would it? The Iranians and the Israelis were dealing with each other in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War. So this is not an existential question. It's a political question. And at the heart of it, the Palestinian issue needs to also be addressed to have that grand bargain, which is what you're alluding to.
Indeed, and we shouldn't forget about that. Sanam Naragi Andelini, thank you very much indeed. Well, Sir Keir Starmer has told MPs that the UK should be prepared for the Iran war to carry on for some time, stressing that he didn't want Britain to be dragged into it. Well, let's get more now from our political editor, Gary Gibbon. Gary.
Keir Starmer was the first to give credibility, really, of major public figures to Donald Trump's claim that there was some sort of beginnings of a negotiation potentially going on with Iran. Keir Starmer said, yes, I'd heard about that, I knew about that, suggesting that there are, even in this faltering relationship, bits of that relationship that continue. But, as you say, he didn't give much credibility to the idea that it will actually work and end the conflict, saying that he was working on the basis that the conflict will go on for some time. He was asked how he felt about Donald Trump insulting him in public, and his answer was fascinating here because he seemed to sort of almost wallow in the fact that he finds himself unusually on this issue, the right side of the bulk of public opinion. And he projected the whole thing as a battle of wills between two equals, the guys trying to bully me into a position I don't want to occupy. Have a listen to what he said here.
Notwithstanding the pressure that comes from elsewhere, I will remain laser focused on what is in the British national interest. And a lot of what is said or done is undoubtedly said and done to put pressure on me. I have no doubt about that. I understand exactly what is going on, but I'm not going to be wavering on this. I'm the British Prime Minister, and my job is to be absolutely focused on what's in the British national interest.
After that session with MPs, Keir Starmer went pretty much straight into a meeting of Cobra and an unusual cast list there, because in addition to the normal cabinet ministers, here you can see him was the governor of the Bank of England also turning up for this meeting, where they were going to discuss what sort of help might be rational, what sort of interventions might be wise for the government to make given the pressure on businesses, on farmers, on individuals because of raised fuel prices. And what became clear during the day was that the government doesn't want to go anywhere near the sort of big bazooka that was deployed by the Liz Truss government, Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, who unveiled it. That 40 billion of blanket help for people. They are looking at targeted help if they are looking at help. We're going to hear more about it tomorrow. We'll probably also hear that they want to give the Competition and Markets Authority more teeth to take on anyone who's profiteering, something they say the CMA came up with some plans for this back in 2022. They think they should be implemented.